Today we're going to talk about changes to existing spells. We're doing multiple videos on this. This script alone is like 32 pages long, so I have to split them up. I'm sorry, guys. Today we're going to talk about spells that seem to follow new spell design philosophies specifically. In other words, groups of spells that seem to have been changed in a similar way. Welcome to Pack Tactics, where we learn to spell. Let's start with the easy stuff. Buffs to healing spells. Namely, Cure Wounds, Healing Word, Mass Cure Wounds, and Mass Healing Word. All of these heal more. Cure Wounds and Healing Word heal twice as much as they did previously, even when upcasting. Mass Cure Wounds heals 2d8 extra at its base level, and now increases by 2d8 each level instead of 1d8. And finally, Mass Healing Word heals 1d4 extra at its base level, but didn't receive a buff at its upcasting. Additionally, all of these spells work on constructs and undead now. That was not a thing before, so if you have an autognome in your party, you can heal them. I do really like these changes, but I don't think these changes will change how we play. We should use them sparingly, even though they heal more. I made a full guide on how to heal people a long time ago, and I still think this is relevant. Next, some spells now target more creatures upon upcasting them, while they did not before. Namely Jump, Hideous Laughter, Spider Climb, Hideous Form, and Freedom of Movement. I think this was mostly because of the changes to Twin Spell for Sorcerer, which now basically allows you to increase a spell's effective level for 1 sorcery point. Though Freedom of Movement isn't a spell sorcerers normally get, so I might be completely wrong with that theory. Some other cool changes here are that Hideous Laughter now works on creatures with an intelligence of 4 or lower, and Jump is actually a great movement increase for 20 feet, even for vertical distances. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a great spell, but it's definitely a lot better than it used to be. Next, now let's talk about persistent AoE spells. For the most part, these spells now only have their effect proc when a creature moves into the area, or ends its turn in the area. In the old version, it was basically a coin toss to see whether an effect would proc at the start or end of someone's turn. Now it's way more consistent. Though there are some spells that were skipped in this process, I don't really know why. The spells that are excluded are Web, Zone of Truth, and Sleet Storm. It's kind of funny, but whatever. I'm sure there's more spells, but that's all I could notice for now. As for the spells that were affected by this, you might notice that these spells additionally proc their effect upon casting the spell. I think this is to try to balance out the fact that 1, creatures will not be affected as often with the new spell design, as they can just walk out of the area before they'd be harmed. Second would be creatures that would originally be dead before they got their turn, now get their actions out before potentially dying. I don't think it completely balances it out, but it does lead to a further emphasis on Nova damage, which is always strong. There are some spells that make an exception, which I'll note. Cloud of Daggers. Besides the general changes I mentioned, you can now also move the cloud as an action up to 30 feet, which I suppose is convenient. Gust of Wind only received the previously described changes, so nothing special. As for Moonbeam, this has some greater changes. You now deal damage when moving the beam into someone. I don't think this works like a cheese grater where you can move it back and forth. I think you can only move it from A to B, and the damage it deals only happens at B. That makes sense, right? I think it would be ridiculous if it works like a cheese grater. Anyways, while creatures can just move out of the area now and not take damage, at least you can consistently damage them by using your action. Nevertheless, with how small the area is, I don't think you'll consistently get the damage from them ending their turn inside it. So I think this is a nerf. Speaking of nerfs, shapeshifters no longer have disadvantage on saving throws, but that's not a big deal. A spell that got changed in a similar way is Spirit Guardians. It basically got Baldur's Gate-ified. There's no longer going to be mass confusion whether it deals damage when you move into creatures with it, because right now it obviously does that, and many other Emanation-esque spells work like this now. Some of these emanations I'll show later on. I think with the way this is written, you do an even bigger burst damage around you when you cast the spell, as the emanation now enters creatures' spaces. So that's even more Nova. On subsequent turns, I think this is a damage loss, except if creatures need to enter the area to reach you, as that almost certainly means that they will not be able to get out due to the halving of their speed. You can check out my old Spirit Guardians video for more information. I am honestly very surprised they didn't change the halving of speed to difficult terrain. I thought for sure they would do that, but nope. On that note, they did change how you can exclude creatures. Instead of needing to see them, you only need to be able to choose them. So basically know of their existence. This is actually a really good change because in the past, this used to kill a ton of innocent NPCs. I actually have a lot of stories and they're all really funny. I'll tell some of them really quickly. I remember we were dungeon crawling. The cleric had their Spirit Guardians up. There was a prison, and inside one of the cells was a king. This king was badly hurt. We eventually got the cell open, and the cleric approached him. That killed the king instantly, because Spirit Guardians killed him. So we failed that quest because we forgot Spirit Guardians functioned like that. Another one was when I played with Trent Monk for like a year. I had an invisible imp, and the cleric kept killing it every single time because Spirit Guardians. It was pure accident every single time. Anyways, back to this video. So Control Water only received the basic changes, but does not deal damage when you first use the Whirlwind Pool effect, only if someone enters the area or ends its turn there. As for Black Tentacles, it does deal damage upon creation. I think this spell might not feel the change from start of turn to end of turn too much, as it does create difficult terrain, which makes creatures be stuck in it for longer. It did get a bit of a nerf though. Instead of a straight strength or dexterity check to escape, it's now an athletics check, which means some creatures can add their proficiency bonus. Though realistically, I think there are so few creatures with this proficiency that it might be a buff in disguise, as dexterous creatures that aren't strong don't get out as easily anymore. As for Cloudkill and Blade Barrier, neither of these two changed beyond the default changes. And finally, Forbiddance. It does deal damage on entering or at the end of someone's turn, instead of entering and at the start of someone's turn, like the others, but it doesn't deal damage upon creation, sadly. It did get a bit of a buff though, as it can now affect aberrations. I do think that makes a lot of sense. I do believe that most of these spells that I mentioned are worse than what they were before, but generally their place in the meta has remained unchanged. Like obviously, if you see Spirit Guardians, pick Spirit Guardians. If you see Forbiddance, pick Forbiddance. Now let's talk about summon spells. If you're familiar with Tasha summons, they're all Tasha summons. The book includes Summon Apparition, Summon Beast, Summon Celestial, Summon Construct, Summon Dragon, Summon Elemental, Summon Fae, Summon Fiend, and Summon Undead. Their stat blocks are basically the same and they still require expensive components. I hate all of these because they're expensive and they suck. But hey, at least I can still use Summon Greater Demon, which is a fantastic spell. Link in the description if you want to know how to use it. It's kinda dangerous. Now let's move on to conjure spells. These conjure spells do not conjure creatures anymore. That is incredibly sad. Now, let me be 100% clear, and I said this last time too in the playtest. Some of these spells are fine mechanically, but their names have nothing to do with their effects. Let's start with Conjure Animals. Its effect is completely different from the old version, and its duration has gone from an hour to 10 minutes. This is very comparable to Spirit Guardians. However, there are some key differences. 1. Instead of it being centered on you, it's centered on the spirits. It's kinda like Moonbeam, but you can keep it centered on you by moving it with you if you wish. Second, its effect is a bit smaller than Spirit Guardians, and creatures can actually walk through the middle of the spell, unlike Spirit Guardians. Third, its secondary effect, the advantage on strength saving throws, is much worse than the speed reduction from Spirit Guardians. Enemies can easily get out of this spell. Fourth, and this one is really painful. This does 3d10 damage on a failed save, but no damage on a successful one. It's not half damage. Let's do some math. Let's say an enemy fails 50% of the time for either this spell or Spirit Guardians. The expected value of the former is 8.25. 5, whereas the latter has an expected value of 10.12. And the AoE itself is bigger, so this adds up quite a bit. This spell used to be a powerhouse in control and DPR, and now it's just an okay spell at best. Now, I understand that conjure animals back in the day was a problem spell, but this could have been changed in so many better ways. One of them is really obvious, like, hey, this summons 2 creatures that are really powerful. That could be fun, but whatever, it's too late now. I really don't like this spell at all. Next, Conjure Barrage. Compared to the old version, this got some shiny changes. Instead of 3d8 damage, it now deals 5d8 damage on a failed save. Additionally, instead of affecting all creatures in a 60-foot cone, you can now choose which creatures you want to affect. The downside is you need to see them though, but it's still a very nice buff. I think this is comparable to Fireball, and it's really good on the Ranger. I'll be using this on my Rangers from now on. It's a worthwhile pick. A lot of people are really mad about Rangers right now, and so am I, but like, this is actually kind of a highlight. This is a good blast spell. Now for 4th level spells, let's look at Conjure Minor Elementals. My poor Twingas, they're gone, reduced to atoms. If you want to know how crazy this spell was back in the day, link in the description. Anyways, this new spell, to be honest with you, this has good upcast, and I do think this can be quite effective on a Moon Druid with something like 3 attacks. The difficult terrain is not a bad bonus either. Other than the Moon Druid, I don't think this is worthwhile picking up. Next, Conjure Woodland Beings, another Spirit Guardians lookalike. Even more so now though. This actually does deal more damage than Spirit Guardians and does half on a save. Disengage as a bonus action is also not bad. You can basically kite enemies with this and force them to dash. They'd probably give up at some point, but that's all the better. I still believe this is worse than Spirit Guardians, as Spirit Guardian's secondary effect is so insanely good. But the increase in damage and disengage as a bonus action does make it a pretty good 4th level spell. I will be using this. Now for 5th level spells, Conjure Elemental. This sucks. It's similar to Guardian of Faith, but it requires concentration. Sure, it can restrain people, but the thing is, a single target restrained effect is really not incredible for a 5th level spell, even if there's damage added to it. It's nice that you'll have an easier time to keep people in it, as they'll have disadvantage on the save due to being restrained, but I still think this sucks. Next, Conjure Volley. Similar to Conjure Barrage, it now works on creatures of your choice rather than all of them. The area for this spell is massive, so I do think this is worth picking up. Now for 6th level spell, Conjure Fae. This is spiritual weapon. Like, how is this you conjuring Fae? It doesn't make any sense. It even deals less damage than spiritual weapon. This really sucks. I know you can move more than spiritual weapon, and it has a secondary effect allowing you to frighten 1 creature per round at most. But come on. Old Conjure Fae was insanely good. Now it's just crap. Finally, 7th level, Conjure Celestial. You don't do anything remotely similar to conjuring a Celestial. You get a Moonbeam plus. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't like people summoning Koaddles, especially due to their change shape feature. I thought that was cringe. The only thing that was cool about it though was you got to turn your friends into furries. But anyways, I don't know about this direction. The spell's effects aren't terrible. It does more damage per target than Spirit Guardians. But guys, this is literally just a light with effects. That's everything about conjure spells. Now let's move on to smite spells. Every smite spell works like this now. They are a bonus action to cast, which you take immediately after hitting a creature with a melee weapon or an unarmed strike. They have a range of self and require a verbal component only. While all smite spells required concentration in the 2014 Player's Handbook, there are only 2 that do that now, which I'll note when we get to them. Here's the biggest change to the smite meta. Divine Smite is now a spell, and in line with the other smite spells, it requires a bonus action to be used. While you can use this with unarmed strikes, it comes with a plethora of negative consequences. 1. You can only use it it once per turn now, as you only have one bonus action. While it's unlikely that it's optimal to use Divine Smite multiple times in a row, there are situations where this is the optimal move. I'll give you an example. Ghosts that can possess people. You need to kill them as soon as possible. Now you're gonna have a harder time with that. 2, you cannot use it as part of an attack outside of your turn. It's a bonus action use. 3rd, you need to spend a bonus action. This means that you will lose damage compared to the 2014 version. You can't use your bonus action attack if you smite. That's a big problem. 4th, you cannot combine this smite with other smite spells now. That's not a big deal, but it's worth mentioning anyways. I absolutely despise the changes to Divine Smite. I'm fine with it working as a spell, but the first 3 points that I made is a huge downside. Now let's move on to a smite spell that I really like. Searing Smite. This is one of the spells that no longer requires concentration, and the fire you ignite the target with can no longer be dosed with an action or water. Originally, when I first looked at this, I was just like, oh, this looks like crap. But then I thought about it and did the math for it, and it's actually really insane. So Searing Smite deals its ignition damage before the target makes a saving throw. This is actually massive. To calculate the average damage this spell deals now, we can use the geometric series. First, we find the average number of d6s we gain beyond hitting the enemy. Let's assume there's a 50% chance that the enemy fails on a Constitution saving throw. We always roll at least 1d6 before the spell fizzles. So we deal on average 3d6 damage with this. 4d6 damage on a crit, while previously it was 2d6 damage with 3d6 damage on a crit. This together with its incredible upcasting that increases all d6s makes this spell quite a lot better than Divine Smite in terms of damage. That's assuming creatures that aren't immune or resistant to fire damage, of course. The lower their fail chance, the less damage you do on average, of course. But even if we plummet it to 30% failure chance, this is still incredible. I don't think they did the math for this. This is awesome. I love this spell. Next, Thunderous Smite. The only change is that it no longer requires concentration, which is nice, but it's not a crazy spell. Wrathful Smite. This was my favorite smite back in the day, and now they killed it. Old Wrathful Smite was the most underrated spell in the entire game. Sure, this spell no longer requires concentration anymore, but it's a save to be frightened now instead of a check, and it doesn't require the target to spend an action to escape the condition anymore. That makes the spell really, really bad. As for Shining Smite, I mentioned this in a previous video, this is an incredible smite spell, but it's one of the 2 smite spells that require concentration. As for 3rd level Binding Smite, no longer requires concentration, which is nice, but I don't think it's very good. Staggering Smite improved a lot compared to the old version. Instead of the target having disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, and can't take reactions until the end of the user's next turn, it now stuns the target. It also no longer requires concentration. The problem is this is a 4th level spell that removes a turn from one creature for 1 round, with the extra benefit of having advantage against them. This is quite expensive, and the damage itself just sucks. And finally, Banishing Smite. Oh, Banishing Smite. It now allows for a saving throw instead of banishing on a hit. And the extraplanar creatures return to the space they left instead of staying gone. Against non-extraplanar creatures, it is better than banishment, but a single target banishment isn't crazy. Now that the smite spells are done, now let's move on to the last category, transformation spells. So the days of replacing your own hit points are gone. All of these spells now make you retain your hit points and hit point dice, but they give you temporary hit points equal to those of the form you transform into. If those temporary hit points are depleted, you turn back to your original form. This is a nerf because you can't stack temporary hit points with more temporary hit points. But it's really not that big of a deal. It's not a massive nerf. The spells that were changed in this way are Polymorph, Animal Shapes, Shape Change, and True Polymorph. While Polymorph is basically the same as it was before, the others receive some more changes. Animal Shapes, for example, now allows creatures to leave their changed form as a bonus action. Shape Change is clearer in its language that you transform into the stat block of the creature that you have seen. Another important part here is that they have now written it out clearly that you retain only parts of your stats, never stats of the creatures you turn into. Now for the big boost, you can use any spellcasting the target has as well as your own. This is super strong because you can use all your spell slots from the form you turn into and then go into another form and repeat. You can keep changing forms to keep your temporary hit points high, and your equipment can shift and change to fit you when you change form, which is quite useful. There are some losses here though. Outside of your stats, HP, and spellcasting, you keep nothing from your class or species. This means that keeping concentration will be a lot tougher, but you can rely on Nova to get things out as fast as possible. Last spell for this video, True Polymorph. For the most part, this spell has remained the same. A big nerf is that you can no longer use the spellcasting feature from spellcasting creatures you turn into, as you cannot cast spells while transformed from a creature into a creature, or even speak for that matter. I think this spell is a lot worse off, and I don't like how you can't properly communicate with your own party, but it's still an insanely strong pick. If you're using this, I hope somebody in the party has telepathic bond. And that's it for today. There will be another spell video, but I don't know when that will come out. Hopefully soon. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I earned your subscription and maybe your support on Patreon. By the way, if you donate to my Patreon, you get videos early, which means more content from this book. Anyways, bye bye!